Hello and welcome to another painting run through. Today I'll be painting up from start to finish this Taelor miniature from the Hide Swords box set by Wyrd Miniatures. I've already undercoated the miniature with Tamiya Fine Surface Primer in grey. My first task will be to begin work on the overalls, which I'm going to go for a kind of denim look to them. I will be attempting to do this by glazing, which means applying the highlight color as my base coat and then shading down with my mid-tone and my shade color. The colors I'll be using for this are as follows. My highlight color will be Troll Blood Blue to get that blue denim look, and my mid-tone will be Coal Black. And finally, I will be using Thalma Black for my deep shadows. So let's get started. I'll start with some of the Troll Blood Blue base, get it on my wet palette and begin base coating. So this is a fairly time consuming process, so I'll speed it up. This particular stage of the process is not difficult. It consists of getting 2 to 3 even and thin base coats all over the areas that we want to paint this way, which consists of all of the coveralls. Now that we've done with our base coat, we'll start on our first glaze color. So this is just me getting my dry palette sorted out, specifically dry palette with wells. This is advisable because we will be making a very, very thin glaze, almost a wash, with our coal black mid-tone. What you can see here is me getting my consistency just about right. I'm continually adding water until the paint is very thin. On my working paper, I'm testing the opacity of the paint to see how thin it is. Once I'm satisfied that it's just thin enough, I will begin laying down my mid-tone. The process for this is fairly time consuming. What I'm going to do is start at the very top of the figure and drag my brush all the way down to a shaded area. This gets a very, very thin coat of our glaze onto the entire surface that we're trying to begin to shade. What will happen eventually is this glaze layer will dry. We'll start about 2/3 of the way down, 1/3 of the way down, and repeat the process to gradually darken the model from the top being slightly lighter to the bottom being darkened by successive layers of glaze. On the very underside of the legs and in the crevices and creases, I am being fairly liberal with the glaze, trying to get as much of that initial shadow as possible. You do get a good transition out of this, but it is time consuming, so I think for all our sakes I will speed this up. So as you can see, we're beginning to get some of our shade from the glazes of coal black. So we are going to continue to do this in order to further get more of a contrast between our highlight color and our mid-tone. At some point you'll see me put some more of the highlight tone down. This is me getting ready to bring back some of the higher highlights with a thin layer of the glaze. Okay, we're just about done with the mid-tone. Now to bring on some shading with Thalma Black, prepared in a glaze similar to the coal black. Okay, so correction. When I was preparing this video, I accidentally overwrote the files that involved me putting in the black shades. So yeah, here's basically the end result without actually going over any of the steps I took to get there. I apologize. No matter though, now we're going to get to work on the flesh tone. So just playing around with a selection of colors I think I'm going to use. I do have a couple of whites up front, but in the end I didn't end up using them. Instead we'll use the first three. They are Rin Flesh as our highlight, Midland Flesh as our midtone, and Cardic Flesh as our shade tone. This stage we'll be laying down our midtone with Midland Flesh in the same manner that we did with the coal black on the coveralls. Okay, base coating rules apply. 2 to 3 coats minimum due to it being a P3 paint and very thin. Also ensure to let each layer thoroughly dry to avoid things like crumbing and the like. I didn't actually do that, so in the final result my paint job was a little patchy. Now we are moving on to putting in our shade, so we'll be using Cardic Flesh for this, and just as with the glazing we did with the jumpsuit, we will be putting it on using very, very thin layers of glaze. So same rules apply. The first layer would start at the very top and go all the way down, and with each subsequent layer we'll shade slightly less and less of the model, with the recesses such as under the armpits, between the breasts, under the neck, and so on, receiving the most of the shade color. For painting the face itself, I'm concentrating my shading on the eye sockets, on either side of the nose, under the nose, and around the mouth. Unfortunately, this is a very time-consuming process, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit. What I'm doing here is continually applying the shades to all of the recessed areas until I am happy that all of the recessed areas are sufficiently shaded. Usually I just eyeball this to get it right. Okay, I've now prepared my highlight color and I'm glazing this time, except I'm going upwards, starting with, say, painting one whole of the miniature, then 2/3 in the up direction, then 1/3 in the up direction to create a transition from down to up for going from dark to light. I'm also hitting some of the more prominent areas of the flesh, such as the tendons around the neck, the nose, the chin, and so on. Generally, anywhere on a human face that tends to catch a lot of the downward falling light from, say, being outdoors. The final stage, once I'm satisfied with my highlights and my shades, is to glaze the midtone over the entire model to unify the various colors. Okay, at this point I'm going to begin work on some of the leather strapping. So the colors I'll be using are there. We'll start with the base coating stage of Umbral Umber, I believe. Correction, we'll also be doing some of the other strapping another color. The one I nominated is Thornwood Green. We'll be doing that on the boots and some of the upper strapping on the overalls. Alright, at this stage we are laying in some of the highlights for our Thornwood Green. The color we are using for this stage, I believe, is Rucksack Tan. So yeah, this is the glazing process once again that I've demonstrated on both the flesh and the coveralls, except I'm applying it to a very, very small area. My paint also isn't as thin as I was over the larger surface areas, thus bringing us a little more of the pigment down and bringing it close to layering rather than glazing in many respects. It's fine though. I think it, at this scale, I suppose, I think it works a lot better than glazing at any rate. So I'm doing it more conventionally on the boots, starting from, yeah, since it's the highlight, I'm actually starting from the bottom and glazing up, I believe. And in cases where there's a bit, where there's more like, I don't know, folds in the boot, I'm applying it more specifically there. But just as with the other glazing processes we've seen so far, it is more of a case of do it, let something dry, go do something else, and repeat ad nauseum until you are done. So I am going to speed it up at this point. At this point, I'm preparing a shade color for the Thornwood Green now. I'm glazing more or less in the way I was with the coveralls, except I'm focusing a lot more on the underside, where obviously the shadows are. I'm also manually putting it in some of the creases. Now I'm moving on to the highlighting for the umbral umber color on the leather components, and for this I'm using bootstrap leather. So once again, in the same manner, I will do very, very thin layers of the color, more of a glaze, on the very, very upper half. And as you can see, since I'm doing the belt, the color is confined to a very, very small area. So with this level of detail, just want to take your time and not mess it up. You can also notice that I'm not really bothering to focus into the areas that are difficult to reach, like say in between her arms where she's got a bit of a belt. That just don't bother. It's very difficult to do, and you probably won't even be noticed unless you're painting to an extremely high competition standard. At this point I am commencing the shading of the leather. So for this I used a roughly 50-50 mix of umbral umber, the base color, and the usual P3 black, Thalma black. And once again I'm putting a very, very thin layer on the lower half of everything that needs to be shaded, and also in the deepest recesses of, say, for example, the gloves. Alright, now we are beginning to base coat the suspender straps. I think I'm doing this blood tracker brown, but I'm not entirely sure. At this point I decided to put a couple more shades on the, I think it's some of the leather components in between the coveralls and the boots, just to hopefully let some of that shade run into the recesses and provide a little bit more definition between the two components. Here I'm applying another highlight to the leather straps around the top of the boots. Well, I think I'm going to skip over a lot more of the gribbly little bits on the models, such as the soles of the boot and all of the minor details such as that. The general rule of thumb, at least that I applied for this miniature, is I did not try to do too much glazing or anything like that, because with such a small surface area, it's really difficult to get a transition. Instead, I just stuck to more conventional layering and highlighting techniques with slightly thicker paint for better control. What am I doing? Looking up a color there. Okay, well, that's probably past me doing something that isn't particularly interesting. I'll skip over this. Okay, and now we're going to make a start on the hair, I believe. Was I? What am I doing? Okay, yep. I'm just putting some, I think that's, yeah. I'm putting a bit of a shade on the suspenders, just using a very thin glaze of, I think, the natural shade for whatever Blood Tracker Brown was. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I should really remember to write all my paints down before I get to the stage of actually making a video. Okay, and that's a bit of moldy ochre, I believe. Yeah, I'm getting into the stage of this project where I'm doing a lot of things at once, simply to try and expedite the entire process, because my painting time is fairly limited, so I try to get done what I can in what little time I have to do it. So yeah, this stage is not fancy. A thin layer of the moldy ochre in a glaze on the upper edge of the suspenders to try and get just a little bit of contrast going. Alright, now we're moving on to the hair. So I'm going to be trying to do a blonde. So this is my first mistake. Well, I've made many mistakes so far, but that's one. I forgot to add in just a little bit of Cygnus Yellow to my base coat of Menoth White base to get that golden blonde appearance. So now that's corrected, I'll proceed with the base coat. So also you can see there that my paint is very thin, so this entire process is going to take many layers. Another thing that'll come back to bite me later on is the there's actually a pair of goggles on the hair. Like the sculpting on some of the Wyrd Miniature stuff is pretty soft, and my eyesight's not so great, so I didn't notice until I'd pretty much finished. So yeah, I treated those little details like hair and painted them as such. So we'll correct that when it comes to it. Okay, now we're on to highlighting the hair on the miniature. So first of all, we're going to start with, I think, the Menoth White highlight mixed in with a little bit of yellow, and we're just going to try and pick out some individual strands in the hair all over the miniature, and we're going to do this multiple times. Since this is a color that I'm mixing up a little bit, I'm trying to take my time to get it right. So that's why you can probably see me every now and then do lots of back and forths between the paint bottles and my wet palette. I found this stage of the process quite time consuming, as I had a bit of trouble picking out the individual strands of hair. Once again, some of the Malifaux sculpts, while they do make some pretty detailed miniatures, the actual details are pretty soft, and I found them difficult to pick out visually, so yeah, that's generally why this takes a bit of time to accomplish. And for our final highlight, it will be just the pure Menoth White highlight color. I'll be picking out the most raised strands of hair and the very tips of the hair in this color. Now we will apply a bit of a shade, a bit of a glaze to tone down some of the yellow of Rucksack Tan. In the end, I went back and did a couple more glazes of this to bring the color down some more and make it look a little more natural. And here we're doing the headband that is separating that ponytail from the rest of her head. I'm doing it the same color roughly as the rest of the coverall, so I'm starting at the mid-tone. So I'm base coating it coal black, and later on I'll be doing a glaze to shade it down to pure Thelma black. And of course I do believe I'm picking out her ears there. Yeah, because it was hard to see them given the, once again, detail of the sculpt and my own failing vision. Alright, and I do believe at this stage I applied a bit more shading to some of the brown on the soles of her boots. Okay, so now we are moving on with metallics. So we'll start with our colors. We are going to do a base of pig iron and a highlight of cold steel, and we will be shading with coal black and I believe Thelma black as well. So base coating is pretty simple, as we've established by now. 2 coats maximum for this one, as I recollect. So I think I'll skip through the worst of it, and I'll get back to you once we get to something different. Now that we are done with all our base coating, as you should also note, I also went ahead and just base coated all of the buttons, buckles, and stuff like that as well. We'll get on with our shades. So we're going to glaze our shades in, and to start with, we'll get our coal black, thin it down, and as you can see here, I am very carefully painting the underside of all of the metallic components. And as I was shading the flesh and the cloth, dragging it down, starting again, selecting a new surface area, and repeating until I am happy with the shade. So let's proceed. Another thing with metallics is you generally want to up the contrast, as metals are shinier, quite frankly, than most other materials on the model. So yeah, if you can really bring that contrast, it'll start to look like actual metal. Now, to enhance our shading, we are going to repeat the process with a Thelma black glaze. This is an overall glaze to dull down the metal just a bit, and also I'm going to focus it a bit more into the recesses to further bring that contrast. Alright, here I am bringing back some of the metallic sheen with some cold steel. So I've thinned this out quite dramatically, and all I'm doing is applying it to the very edges of things like the hammer, some of the rings on the haft of the hammer, and also on her arm, like that big round plate up the top gets a slight coat, while all of the edges also get edged highlighted as well. Here I'm using that black glaze to put a bit of shading on the other metallics, such as the buttons and belt buckles, just to try and get some of that contrast, even though it's a very small and, quite frankly, hardly noticeable area. So moving on to the OSL, there are some runes carved on the side of the hammer that I want to add a slight glow effect to. OSL is something I need a lot of practice with in particular, so I'm going to attempt to make the runes glow a little bit. So to start with, we're doing a glaze all over of the arcane blue from P3, and then I'm going to take a really thin down Mora white and paint it directly into the crevices to the best of my ability. Hopefully with the paint being a little more watery, it'll run in on its own accord a lot easier. Once the white is in, we will go over with another layer of arcane blue. A bit of this will run into the crevices and hopefully stain the edges of the white slightly to mix the white and the blue a little bit and blend the glowing colors together just slightly. This OSL effect in the end didn't come out as pronounced as I would have liked, but it looked okay. Now we're going to begin working on the face. So I must admit, this is a part which didn't come out as good as I would have liked it, but we're going to bring some Scorn Red and we're going to use it to give the cheeks a little bit of a rosy tint. Now, I had to go over this again multiple times with the mid-tone and the highlights to tone it down a little bit, because my initial attempt at glazing this in was a little rough and ended up producing tide marks which ruined the entire effect. So when doing this sort of thing, be careful, keep your paint thin. It has to be thin, but it can't be runny. That's what causes things like tide marks to happen. This is the part where I'm beginning work on the eyes. So to prepare the sockets to take the white I'll be using, I'm first reapplying a bit of the shade tone, not as a glaze but as an actual layer, to further differentiate where those eye sockets are. Now I'm applying the white. The color I'm using is Manoth White Highlight, I believe. And yeah, this process is really fiddly. I'm actually using a Winsor & Newton size 2, but taking my time. I'm also not painting the entire eyeball at once. I'm just doing a little bit, withdrawing, inspecting my work, and then going back if it needs more. So it took me about 20 minutes to get this right. Sadly, there's no magic bullet for this. Just be careful and try to avoid making a mess. This is the part where I painted more than I wanted to, so what I'm doing is I'm taking the mid-tone and I'm going back and I'm bringing the color back by painting successive layers over the white I've painted on until I'm happy with the shape of the eye. Alright, the color I chose to use for the eye pupil is just pure iron hull grey. If I was aiming for a much higher level of quality, I would have attempted to do a multicolored eye, which, quite frankly, I don't think I have the motor skills or the vision for. I'm going to skip over the rest of this, as it does take me multiple tries to get the pupil just right, and the cleanup work is a bit tedious. So let's move on to some of the final stages. Here I'm taking the shade color of Cardic Flesh and using it to put a thin line between the flesh color and any other non-flesh items such as clothes, hair, etc. This is to help provide further definition on the model. And here we have our finished model. So, I don't think it turned out as well as I could have made it. I think a lot went wrong in the initial building phase. There were a lot of gaps to fill and things didn't quite go together as well as they should have. You'll also notice that I went back and did a quick rush job on the goggles off camera that I had mentioned earlier but had completely forgotten about until I was getting close to the final review. I also did a quick color, shade, and highlight of the steel caps on her boots. Overall though, for a maybe mid to high tabletop quality model, I'm quite happy with the way it turned out. As I mentioned earlier, the OSL could have done with a bit more work, but yeah, for what I was going for, it worked pretty well. You'll also notice that the eyes are one eye is a bit brighter than the other. This was due to me going back and fixing up my mistake earlier. Another thing I'll mention about the eyes and face is that I went back and, well, for the lips, I repainted them the base color Cardic Flesh and highlighted them with a 50-50 mix of the mid-tone of Midland Flesh and Cardic Flesh. And I also gave the lips a gloss coat as well to make them a little shiny. Same thing with the eyes to make them stand out a little bit more. I wasn't a big fan of the suspenders as I had trouble getting it together when I was doing the initial assembly, and as a result, in a lot of cases, the attachment points on the front don't quite look right, at least to me. If you also look hard enough, you can still see the mold line on the exposed arm and shoulder, which is unfortunate, but I suppose this will be a lesson for me to go back and make sure I do my preparation properly in future. The part I am the most happy with out of the entire process would definitely be the metallics. I'm starting to think I'm getting a handle on how to properly shade and highlight metallics without just using the standard wash all over dry brush process. So yeah, that about wraps it up. After I finish my Infinity, I'll think of another video to do. It probably won't be another Malifaux one. So I have to get started on another project for a convention sometime early next year, which will take me a while. So I think for my next video it will be the other half of the Halo Fleet Battle Starter set or some Warzone Resurrection. I haven't decided yet. Anyway, usual YouTube disclaimers, like, favorite, subscribe, and I'll see you later.